And so I want you to remember, like the captives, they were handpicked. God knew what they were going to go through, and he made provisions for them to still succeed. So God is always going to be our ready help. You know, I was saying to my brother this morning, 369 days ago, my mother passed away. And there were days I would just say, how you doing? I'm okay, my mother died. Because it just felt so surreal. It just didn't make sense, those words coming together and coming out of my mouth. But I know that God kept us. There were days when depression and grief was just like a persistent bully. But God kept us. You get a call and someone saying, I'm coming by, and you look at the door and somebody would leave a basket or something, or somebody would just call and say, I'm praying for you. And you realize it's moments like that you realize the gift of community. Because if it's me today, it's you tomorrow. I mean, there were days I had funerals stacked up that I couldn't see them in time because there'd be one in the morning and then tomorrow afternoon something else. And it's like, I can't go to all of them. Plus I'm grieving. It's just too much. I remember my mother died and was buried September 21st. And a couple of weeks later, Camille Clark was buried in the same church. And I saw my colleagues standing over the body like they did my mother. And I'm like, how do we do it but God? But God. And so a lot of times we forget that we're still here because of God. And he still has an assignment for us. You know, I'm always grateful when people say, but you don't look like what you went through. Isn't it good? Can you imagine if you look the way you felt sometimes? Because here we are, we look at these young adults. If anybody was going to suffer from PTSD, it would have been them. They were ripped away from their family, their language, and their culture. But they thrived. They didn't show signs of depression because they thrived. They didn't have the failure to launch, which social psychologists are talking about, where people finish school, but they move back home. And then instead of being online trying to find a job, they're playing games all day. And it's like, what's going on? There's this fear of the future because the future no longer looks so predictable. But guess what? It never was. Somehow we deluded ourselves into thinking that my paycheck every 2 weeks was what was keeping me. No. Or I've got my car paid off and I got this, I'm cool. No. I remember when I visited my mother in the hospital and I'd see nurses coming on duty for a 12-hour shift looking like they were already raggedy tired. I'm like, how are you doing it? I get home and I have a toddler and she wants to play when I want to sleep, so I spend time with her. And then when she wants to go to bed, now it's time for me to come back to work. And they showed up every day in the ICU. And when it was time for a day off, sometimes they couldn't take it because they were understaffed. And you're like, look at God, he kept us. And so when you think about what you're going through, just remember we need to share our stories. Because when we share our stories, you see, the Hebrew boys didn't have to testify because they had a whole sea of haters. Because can you imagine everybody bound there's these three conspicuous figures. Psst, look over there. So nobody needed to tell, guess what, they were thrown in the furnace. Because I'm sure they came and if it was today, they'd be like, they're filming it. It's live streamed. So they didn't have to open their mouths. But guess what I also noticed? Those folks came in real close. They're taking attendance. Look, their hairs weren't singed. They don't smell of smoke and their clothes. Wow. So they really wanted to get a close-up look so they could get the gossip right. So when they saw, they had to attribute it to God. When they saw, it was God who got the worship. And when they saw, it also exposed the lies of the enemy. Because obviously the other men whose God was not Jehovah, they didn't make it. So our testimony is not just about us. It's about God getting glory so somebody else can be inspired to trust God. Because we are on assignment.